Hello, everyone, and welcome to VisGap on behalf of the organizers. It is Christina Gillmann, Michael Krone, Thomas Wischgoll, and myself. You should see us on the screen. We all know that visualization, meanwhile, is quite mature as a field, and it's steadily maturing because we are investing a lot of effort into introspection and our methodologies. But however good the theories that we make are, and however better we can make them, at a certain point, PhD students always have to start coding and working on an actual software project and engineer some visualization software, because this is a requirement for getting actual results, simple things like screenshots, but also doing a proper evaluation of an approach, be it with actual users or with regards to performance. And the software development always entails a lot of complexity. It takes a lot of time and it requires ample knowledge and experience. However, in our field, we still regard it as kind of trivial or at least out of scope, since it is not our core field of research. And that is why we actually want to respectively disagree, and we are having this workshop. We actually started this as a series of events with a Shonan meeting 2 years ago. Then we had an app spotlight at Vis. And last year we had already the first installment of this VisGap workshop. So every time you start a new project, either when a PhD student starts a paper project or you have a new PhD student, always the same questions have to be answered over and over. And it gets kind of tedious over time. Where do you start? Is there a viable system or some framework where you can build upon? How would you choose if there are several options? Also, if that does not apply, you could also ask the questions, which language would you use and what ecosystem comes with that language? Sometimes the first two questions are related, but not always. Then there comes a core question. Will you actually build a throwaway prototype that works for only one paper? Or should the software be still useful a year later, or maybe even sustainable? And there are many other recurring problems, for example, handling large data and so on. And all of this can be quite a pain for the PhD student. And it has a major impact and a non-trivial impact on the scientific outcome and the time to publication of each project. Also then the fact that software development is not rewarded sufficiently in our community, that is something that we actually want to change here. We want to bring about a change in mindset. Still, we will at a certain point face the challenge that there will still be a gap between a research prototype and the real world application. And for some application cases, for example, a meaningful evaluation with a domain expert, this gap cannot be too wide. So this is a compounding problem. Last but not least, even this offers some kind of introspection, because all of these choices that we make, we can learn something from them for future projects, for future papers, and for future software. So without further ado, in this workshop, we will have 2 sessions. The first session will contain the keynote of Timo Ropinski, along with 2 regular talks, and the second session will consist of 2 regular talks and the capstone by Benedict Kempken. Please follow the talks and have a lively online discussion. You can either use the YouTube chat or our Discord channel on the EG server. So thank you, everyone, authors, reviewers, and speakers of today. And I'm looking forward to our talks, and let's have fun. I'm happy and honored to introduce Timo Ropinski as our keynote speaker. Timo is a professor in visual computing at Ulm University, Germany, where he's heading the visual computing research group. Before moving to Ulm, he was professor in interactive visualization at Linköping University in Sweden. Timo holds a PhD from the University of Münster in Germany, where he also finished his habilitation. His research interests lie in data visualization and visual data analysis. Together with his research group, Timo works on biomedical visualization techniques, rendering algorithms, and deep learning models for spatial data. Most of the visualization-related projects are realized through own software frameworks, most prominently through the Inviwo interactive visualization workshop. Inviwo was initiated in 2012, and today Timo will be telling us about the lessons for a sustainable visualization system learned from the Inviwo development. Timo, the stage is yours.
Okay, many thanks for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here today and talk about the lessons we have learned from the Inviwo development over the last years. So what is Inviwo? Inviwo is a free configurable visualization for scientific data. You can find all information at inviwo.org or in this talk I'm going to present here today. So for those who have not known about Inviwo so far, we focus on rapid prototyping of visualizations. As you can see here, this is a main user interface of Inviwo, where we actually see a data flow network, you see an output visualization, and then you can configure the network based on properties. You can do this to render meshes for certain applications, or you can do volume rendering and all these things. Inviwo is developed since 9 years now. It has started at Linköping University when I was still there. And today the majority of the developers are still at Linköping University. We have developers at Ulm University and a few developers also at KTH in Stockholm. The focus is on cross-platform development, where you can use it on Linux and Windows as well. And we have a very liberal licensing scheme, so it's simplified BSD, which means you can use it for any purpose, also commercially. Internally, we see it as a citationware, so if you use Inviwo, we would like to ask you to cite our Inviwo paper from 2019, which has been published in TVCG. It's called Inviwo, a visualization system with usage abstraction levels. And today I'm talking about 6 lessons we have learned from the Inviwo development. And some of them are more basic, still important. Some of them are a little bit more towards the development side of things, and some are more towards the organizational side of things. So first one is work as a team. It's very simple, yeah, but this is of course the key here. And the key is not just to work as a team, but also to have fun as a team and to cooperate as a team. So if you look at the current website of Inviwo, you see these developers listed. This is the current active main developers. And these are all very important people for the success of the Inviwo system. Nevertheless, I would like to point out a couple of names specifically, and the first and foremost is Peter Stenetek. He's a principal research engineer at Linköping University. And he's the de facto manager of the Inviwo project today. So he does a technical lead. He has his hands very deep inside. Despite being a physicist and having actually a PhD in physics, he is actually by heart an engineer and not scared to get deep into the system and changes things in there. And so if you want to have a technical discussion about Inviwo to any depth, talk to Peter. He's very good at that. Also, I would like to mention Daniel Jönsson and Martin Falk. They are both also very deeply involved. Daniel from the very beginning of the Inviwo Foundation. And they both also have organized a tutorial about Inviwo at VCBM in 2019, I believe. And I could also recycle some of the slides here for my talk today. So many thanks to that as well. But of course, to all other developers as well. Without this great team, it wouldn't have been possible. And as I said before, it's not just important to work together, it's also important to have fun together. And especially in the first years, we did regular fishing trips. I was still in Sweden back then, so it was very easy to go out to the Swedish islands to catch fish, and no animals were harmed, of course, here. I'm serious about this one. And so, yeah, this was a very important aspect. I don't want to say, okay, if you want to do such a project, you should go on fishing trips or any trips. But for me, always it helps actually to ask myself for potential new team colleagues, is this the person I would like to go for a fishing trip or not? And do I think the rest of the crew would like that or not? And I mean, if the answer is a clear yes, then this usually helps a lot in the team spirit. And it helps during the development process, because often you have very detailed discussions, and there's feelings involved as well sometimes in strong engineering decisions, and this helps a lot if you can play well with the team together, also on a personal level. The second lesson I would like to talk about is more on the technical side, and it's called abstract, abstract, abstract. So during the Inviwo development, we have identified several technical challenges we had to face, and some of them we have dealt with by abstracting and others not. So when you abstract everything, of course, then you might come to a point where you actually over-engineer your system. And this is, of course, a problem. Your code gets complex and so on. So here I would like to talk about a few things where we have thought abstraction is fine and it's not over-engineering. And the basic rule of thumb there is you over-engineer essentially if you write source code for a problem you do not have, right? And this is difficult to say in the beginning because some problems come up later on in a project, but you need to look a little bit ahead and try to see this. So one core concept where we abstract, and we feel it was a very important decision to abstract there, is usage scenarios. Yeah? So we wanted to support users with different levels of knowledge. So like we wanted to use Inviwo ourselves for doing research, but we also wanted to support application experts doing their own visualization of their data and things like this. Obviously, these people have very different understanding of Inviwo and of visualization in general, and they have different skills. So you can't cater them with the same way of doing things. And this was very clear from the beginning. So what we have aimed at was what we call cross-layer development. And this is what you see here. We have different layers. On the bottom, our low level of abstraction is more technical. We abstract, for instance, OpenGL or OpenCL like as interfaces to the GPU. Then we have a C++ layer. We can have processors. We can composite them, and we can form visualization pipelines. So you could say the level of complexity is actually going up when you go from top to bottom, right? So you can interact with the visualization pipeline very easily, even if you're a layman. But GPU programming is probably something where you should have some previous knowledge about. And this was the core design principle of the Inviwo system. And so I would like to talk about 3 levels of abstraction now: high level, mid level, and low level. So the high level is done through processors and to the network architecture. Yeah? So processors, they use data from imports, which comes in from potentially another processor, and then they consume the data. We call this, they process it, and then they can give data out on an out port. The processors have a name, they have a type, yeah? So you can have several instances of one type. Then you can see the status. So for instance, if all ports are connected, then you know you're good to go. And then processors are controlled through properties, which define the state of them. And so you can also synchronize properties by means of linking. We sort these processors into 2 main groups. Like we have source processors. They do not have imports. They're usually used to bring in data into the system. And then we have sync processors, which do have no outports. They're actually used to bring data out of the system, like an image or a data set you have generated or something like this. And the evaluation starts at the source processors and ends at the sync processors. These processors you can then bring together and form a visualization pipeline. This is our data flow graph. And here, data enters at the top. Here we have a source processor. And then we have a sync processor down here where the result comes out. In this case, it's an image, a rendering of this virus particle. And what we have devised is that we think of processors as functions, yeah, like here K, H, G, and F. We think of the data as the input to these functions, and the properties here P2, P1, and P3, and P4, they parameterize the function, right? So the property can be used to change the behavior of a processor, and then based on the behavior of the processor, the data is processed in the way the developer wants. So this gives us 2 to 3 orthogonal information flow patterns in our data graph. And this is what's illustrated here. Yeah? So what we have is we have the principal connections, which are these colored lines here, which is connecting the ports of a processor. And these connections, they pass data downwards. Yeah? So for instance, here we have a volume source. It reads a volume. The data is passed down to the volume raycaster here. Red means it's a volume, blue means it's an image, and yellow means it's a mesh data type. Then what we also have is we have events, obviously, right? You want to interact with the visualization, so you need to deal with event handling. And events are actually propagated from bottom to top, yeah? So for instance, consider a mouse event is initiated at the canvas level, then this needs to be propagated up because it might have to result in a camera movement here at the mesh renderer. And then what we wanted to also have is an orthogonal scheme to this, to synchronize properties. So properties are defining the states of a processor, and they can be synchronized by linking these processors and specific properties. And this is done before actually evaluating or sending the data through the graph. So let's have a look at the main UI components here, which we have used in order to generate these networks. So when you look at the Inviwo UI, on the left you have the processor list. From there you can drag and drop processors on the main network editor, where you can generate your processor networks, which are representing your data flow graphs. Then for all sync processors which have a canvas associated, you will see the respective canvas and you will see an image you generate. And to change the way you want to generate your image, you can just change the properties for specific processors. Usually the ones for the selected processors are shown on the right and you can edit them. And then we have a message console which gives you basic updates of the process of the system. So with the properties, we have abstracted them in several ways. First of all, we of course reuse certain property types which can be used in certain processors. I would say this is a more basic level of abstraction. And then when you select this processor, you see all these properties we have associated with them. Yeah? And we have defined these properties, as you find in many, not only visualization systems, like a common set of properties you might need, yeah, a string, bool, event properties we have min, max for a range, and things like this. But then we realized quite early on, actually, that the semantics of these properties, of course, may be different, right? So think about, like, you have a vec property, for instance. So what does this vector really represent? And what the vector represents has the influence on how the user thinks about the vector, has the influence on how the user wants to change this vector, right? And therefore, we have abstracted one level on top of this, and these are the property semantics. So property semantics define how a user should think about a certain property. So for instance, if you have an ordinal double property, yeah, so a double value, then we have 4 semantics currently in there. One is the default, where you treat it as a slider. Then we can treat it as text, where you actually have to enter the number if you want. You can treat it as a spin box. It's a rather fancy widget where you can have use a slider to set it up and down. Or you can say, okay, this is always an angle, and then we have an interface which allows you to change the angle of representing this double, actually. If you look into a vec4 property, yeah, then the default is a spin box, but you could also say, okay, vec4 is a color, which is very common in visualization. Then you want to maybe have individual values and float values, or you might want to have a hex encoding, or you might want to say my vec4 is actually a position. Yeah, then we have a direction and a distance. This could, for instance, represent a light source. Similar is true for min-max properties. Yeah, the default is a slider with 2 handles, or you could have a box where you can enter these values, and so on. So these are our semantics where we have abstracted how to interpret those. And since we wanted to expose this on the highest level of abstraction of our user interface, these semantics can be actually chosen during runtime from within the user interface. So you right-click on a property, you choose the semantic, and then the GUI for this property changes, and people can change it in a way they like. Yeah? And here you see, for instance, the semantics we have for the transfer function. I'm going to talk a little bit later about the transfer function in a bit more detail. Then, as mentioned before, you can actually link these properties. Yeah? So you drag and drop in between processors. Then some properties can be linked. You will get this editor where you can define which properties are linked. And you can also use something which we call smart links, where you define some rules for this linking. And all this is the highest level of abstraction. And you can come up with decent visualization systems with multiple synced views and different data sets and different visual representations without any need for programming. But this way is a good way of starting to work with Inviwo, but at some point you might feel, okay, I want to do actually more, something we have not considered in the user interface. And then the next level you should probably look into is the mid-level of abstraction. Yeah? And there we have two ways of doing this, once through the Python world and then through web interfaces. So we have three ways of interacting with Python on this mid-level. Yeah? So one is the network level scripting, where we have built in a Python editor for running scripts. So Inviwo has its own Python editor, which we will see in a minute, and then you can run your own Python script. We also have it on a processor level, where you can actually do interactive prototyping via a Python processor. So you drag and drop a processor from the list, which is called Python processor. It's a skeleton processor, a placeholder essentially. In there you can write your Python code to process your data. And finally, we have a Python package, so you can run Inviwo from within Python, your favorite Python IDE, and then you can generate and use Inviwo visualizations. And all this is done by integrated data handling, as our main data structures, volume, image, layer, and buffer, they can communicate and be represented as NumPy arrays. So let's have a brief look at the Python editor. You can see it here, yeah? And there you can write your Python script, and the Python script can interact with the processor network and tell the processor network to do things. For instance, you might want to write a Python script which animates something you are showing, yeah? Then you want to change the camera position maybe, yeah? And then you need to be able to write a value into the variable responsible for the camera position, here the look from. So in that case, we want to write a vector of 0, 0, minus 20 into it. And if you know everything about the volume raycaster on this mid-level of programming already, then you can write this by yourself. If you say, okay, I haven't written this raycaster myself, so I just want to use it in Python, then you can actually use our user interface in a similar way as we looked at into property semantics, where you can then actually get this placeholder here, and then you can write values to it in order to, for instance, animate. This is just one example. You will find much more examples for this which are shipped within Inviwo and allow you to do different things. I was mentioning this Python skeleton processor, where you can do anything in Inviwo which you can do in Python as well. What you just do is you add a new Python processor to Inviwo. You will have certain placeholders. You can add, for instance, ports to this processor, yeah, in-ports or out-ports. And you can add properties to this processor. These will show up in the GUI. And then you can interact through Python with all other Inviwo processors via linking of properties. And you can implement some functionality in this processor. So that's the Python world. And then I said we also have a web world. This was pretty useful for certain exhibitions Inviwo is used in. And there you can actually showcase and run HTML5 and WebGL inside Inviwo. So you can do it in order to get some more fancy user interfaces into your applications, or to use plotting with Vega, like you see down here. So you essentially can encapsulate the whole web world and bring it into Inviwo and also interact with this one. And then once you feel like, okay, now I've reached my limits on this mid-level, you can dive deeper and go to the low level of abstraction. And this is where most computer scientists, programmers probably will see themselves. So where you have a pure C++ core, and then you have a modular system of plugins. We call them modules in Inviwo. And you can generate apps based on this. So I would say this is the core of Inviwo, where we have basic classes for what is a module, what is a network, a processor, property, and so on. And then on top of this, we implement modules which have certain functionalities. Some are more basic, yeah. Like base is something which encapsulates everything we use quite often, but not as often that we feel it should go to the core. Or we have an OpenGL module, yeah. So there's also an important abstraction lesson we've learned here, or actually we did it right in the first place. We were lucky, I would say. We have abstracted OpenGL out of the core. After we started Inviwo, Apple has, for instance, considered OpenGL as deprecated. When we started Inviwo, OpenGL was a de facto standard. So taking it out of the core means we can not only run Inviwo on any system which does not support OpenGL, but also the life of Inviwo is not depending on the life of OpenGL, which seems to be over at some point in time, or is over maybe already. And then we have some more special modules like vector field visualization. In this case, this is a OpenGL module. You see it derives from BaseGL, which derives from OpenGL. And so this is a zoo of models you have we can reuse. If you feel you want to develop something which is more specific to a certain application, then you can also do this, where you can implement all this functionality which you just want to use for that specific application. So this gives us access to the lowest level of abstraction by means of C++ code. And then we have abstracted also the data structures we wanted to use. Yeah? So when we look at data structures, we deal with the main ones you would consider from a visualization library, like volume, image, or mesh. And then we have certain implementations of these, and we call these representations. So for instance, when you look into a volume, OpenGL volume is a different representation than a CL volume, or a volume which sits in conventional RAM. Yeah? And what we do have is we have converters which take care of the conversion between these representations. And that's so much abstraction that the developer actually does not need to be aware of how this conversation is taking place. And also, it's optimized in a fashion that it will serve the needs of most users. So here's just a quick example how you can deal with such a representation. So, for instance, here we want to have a texture ID for OpenGL volume. Then we have our volume here. We get it from the import of a certain processor we are in currently. Then we define the volume GL, yeah, and we say, okay, give us this representation of type volume GL. And then what we can do is we can get the texture. Now we know this is a volume GL, so we can get the texture, write it into text, get the texture ID, and then we can communicate directly with OpenGL to provide this texture ID. We can also upload the data. Yeah, so here we have a destination volume which we define, and then we want to have a we want to have an editable representation. This means one where we actually want to write our data to. We assume the data is sitting in this variable data here, and then what we can do is we can upload and resize this data and write it into the texture of this volume. Yeah, so this way we can put our data in there. So these are the different levels of abstraction from a user perspective: high level, mid level, and low level. But I also said abstract, 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 but do not over-engineer. So at some point you need to draw a line. Yeah? You can't abstract everything, because then you certainly will over-engineer. And therefore, at some point you have to eliminate alternatives, and you have to take sides on difficult decisions, and you should do this consistently. And here I would like to talk about a few examples where we have discussed this in great lengths, and we have actually taken sides and hopefully have done it in a good and consistent manner. We are at least very happy with it, and we have good reasoning behind our decisions. So the first discussion which comes up almost every Inviwo meeting, I would say, is data versus property. Yeah? As I told you earlier, we have two orthogonal flows, the data flow coming from top to bottom, and then we have the property linking, which is orthogonal to this one. And a common design question which comes with this is it something? Is it a data or is it a property? If it's data, it's mapped to ports, so it will flow like this. If it's a property, then you have GUI elements to edit it. And this question needs to be answered in some way or the other, right? So if you look at the transfer function, for instance, you could say, okay, 1D transfer function is a 1D image, 2D transfer function is a 2D image, 3D is a volume. So why not use the ports for images, volumes, and so on to pass this through? We have decided against it, and this is based, again, on this functional understanding of our processor networks. So when we say properties are actually configuring how these functions operate on data, then if you take the visualization view on things, you can clearly say for a volume renderer, the volume is the data, the transfer function changes how the renderer operates on this data. Yeah? And this is our guiding criterion here, where we think, okay, visualization centered, we can clearly distinguish between data and properties, and this is what we use to take this decision. Another example here with light sources, yeah, so I talked about this property semantics of a vec4, which looks like a light source. We can take this as a property, or the alternative would be a light source is something in here. I would say this is more like the computer graphics view of things, where light sources play a more important role. In visualization, I would say the role of a light source is less dominant. Therefore, we still consider it as a parameterization of our function. Then, when it comes to certain functionalities, the recurring question is this a GUI feature or is it a feature under the hood? So an example I want to talk about here is composite processors. Sorry, there's a mistake in my slide. It says properties, but I'm talking about processors. So what we can do is we can have two processors or more, a set of processors. We can select them, and then we can create a composite out of it to get a reusable thing which looks like one processor, and this can even show up in the processor list so others can use it. So here, this question arises, right? Is this a GUI feature or is this an under the hood feature? When you think about it, first place you would say, okay, maybe it's a GUI feature, right? It makes my network look easier here, and so therefore we can implement it only in the GUI fashion of things. But when you further think about it, then as soon as you start adding composite processors to your processor list, then they become actually features of the Inviwo. And if they are used by others, they might not even be aware that this is a composite processor. So having said this, it makes sense that this composition is even maintained if you develop an application and go to the lowest level of abstraction. Yeah? Because then you have the same mental concept of your processor network as you have in the GUI, and it doesn't change. And therefore, we have implemented this as a under-the-hood concept, yeah, where we actually reuse networks inside a processor. So a processor can have a network, and then it's a composite processor of this network. Another difficult decision was about ports, how to deal with them, if they are container ports, as they are in Inviwo, or if they should be polymorphic ports, as VTK does it, for instance. So one is we have a container class, and the container class can contain, in our case, a data structure. Yeah. In the other case, you would have a port hierarchy, which is actually it's a reflection of your data structure hierarchy. Yeah? So you would have two hierarchies which need to be in sync. We have decided against this polymorphic ports because of two things mainly. Yeah? One is it's easy to support flat ports. What we wanted to have is we wanted to have not only optional ports, but also to have something where you can connect multiple inputs to the same port. And then the question is how to deal with it. And what we do is we just flatten the input. Yeah? So if you connect like 1 volume, 2 volumes, or area of 1,000 volumes, you will get a flattened representation and you can access this. We find this very neat and very handy, this feature. Also, code is simplified because we do not replicate this hierarchy of our data structures. So here's just for the Inviwo volume, you see what we have, and you can think of it as this is needed for meshes, for images, and so on. Yeah? So we decided in terms of simplicity of code and use, we went for container ports, but of course polymorphic ports also have some nice features. So when you take this decision, you don't take them lightly. We discussed all of them in great length and many more actually. These are just some examples. But then the question of course arises, was this really a good decision, right? And this only time will tell in the end. And therefore it's important to deal with the next lesson, and this is eat your own dog food. So we use Inviwo heavily, yeah, for our own purposes. And we do this because we are all very much convinced only if you like your own software, others will like the software too. So here you see 3 usage scenarios where we use Inviwo. One is for doing research. It's a basic tool we use to publish many of our research papers. We use it in teaching. Our students work with Inviwo. And we use it in communication. So here you see Inviwo actually installed in the Ulm Museum, where we visualize the lineman figure. This is the oldest piece of art. And here Petra Olszolowski, which is the State Secretary of Ministry and Science in Baden-Württemberg, and parliamentarian Martin Revoir are actually looking at it. And you see they seem to like it. Yeah? So, and if others like it, that's a good thing. So if we like it, the chance is higher. Others will like it too. To make us like it, we need to have some tools which developers of research software really want to have. And I just want to briefly point out 2, but there's of course many, many more. And one is visual debugging. Yeah? So this is very important for us if we work with Inviwo, that we can debug what we are doing, and that we can also do this across all these levels of abstraction in our user interface. So the worst case scenario is you work on an application together with a domain scientist, and then you look at your code and you go there and it doesn't work. So what do you want to do is you want to have access to development and debugging. So the visual debugging helps us immensely here. So here's an example of how we support it by the concept of so-called port inspectors. So whenever you have a port, to verify that the processor runs properly, you want to know, okay, what is arriving at this port? Is this correct as the way I want it? Yeah? And for that, what we do is we can actually show the content of the port by means of port inspectors, which are very easily to be added by means of own code. Yeah? So in the essence, these port inspectors, we reuse a concept we have used for the composite processors, because these port inspectors, they have their own Inviwo network. And then you can generate this network and you can attach it to a port inspector. And then whenever you hover over this port with a mouse, then behind the scenes, this network is connected to this port. You define a certain input there. And then you see all the canvases which are inside this network. And that way you can configure your debugging very easily. So we find this tool very, very handy. Of course, what's also important is regression testing. Yeah, only if the software is reliable you're working it, you will like it and you can count on it. And yeah, Peter has invested a great deal of time in improving our regression testing system. It does image comparisons to verify that images are generated in the way we want them to look. And it also does performance testing to make sure if we do some re-engineering of some things that it doesn't have a drop in performance. So this is very handy, and again we make sure it's used in a very easy fashion. So actually you can create regression tests even from the main UI in Inviwo and make sure then that your new processor you might have contributed is also quality assured over time. That helped us to publish work more on the technical side, for instance. We have used it for illumination, like Daniel's work on photon mapping, for instance. Dominik has done a machine learning approach to ambient occlusion, which he used Inviwo also for. Jochen used it for isosurface feature visualization. Temporal tree maps were done by Wiebke. And Julian, for instance, worked on technical realization to improve blood vessel visualizations. So you see, these are all Inviwo developers, and they not only develop Inviwo, but then they can also use it for doing their own research projects. And since they are part of the regular Inviwo meeting every 2 weeks, they have the knowledge, and if they have issues, then they can bring it up at these meetings and they can discuss, which again emphasizes the importance of this teamwork aspect. These are more, let's say, technical papers, but then you can also focus on application papers, where you can benefit from the stuff you can reuse, which is available in Inviwo. And here you see a set of these application papers. Martin, for instance, has worked on 3D histopathology. Daniel and Julian more on the medical work. Alex has bended fish, very exotic application. And Satish has worked on physics simulation of solar cells. So these are very diverse applications. It's just an example again. And many of these applications we didn't have in mind when we started, but we believe our levels of abstraction together with the decisions we have taken to avoid over-engineering are a good indicator that this generalizes to many applications we would like to work on in the future. So these were 2 types of papers we could publish based on Inviwo, more technical ones, more applied ones. And I would say the pinnacle of the papers we've published is actually the main Inviwo systems paper. And this was a tough thing to do. Initially, you know, it's difficult to publish system papers. As you are here at this workshop, you're probably well aware of this. And but at some point we decided, okay, we feel like we have an edge on most existing systems, and this is something we feel we need to document properly in our design decisions. And so we published finally in 2019, we decided it's time to publish this paper. And we see it as a key paper for Inviwo, so we see it as the paper to cite when you see Inviwo from a citation-aware aspect. This is just about us working with Inviwo, but of course the most important thing is that other people are also happy with it. And the lesson learned there is you really need to cater collaborators. Yeah, so you should see working with collaborators as something where you actually have to give a lot initially, like writing this basic data reader or implementing this GUI feature they like. Then eventually you will be able to tap their brain and tap into insights they have. And yeah, you can do this only if you first address their basic needs. So the idea was always to work in a collaborative manner, yeah, not just, okay, talk to a collaborator waits somewhere, you do your implementation work and then you are done, but more to be able to do this due to the multiple levels of abstraction. And of course, documentation is key here, that it also goes up through all these levels of abstraction. Therefore, we have extended the Doxygen documentation system, which we heavily use. And you actually can see this even on the highest level of abstraction in the GUI, something which helps collaborators immensely to work on that level and use Inviwo processors. We support them also by creating their own modules. Yeah, they can do this right from the user interface again. So here under tools, you can create your own source and you can add a module, and then you can start working on a lower level, right? So the idea is you have been working on the highest or mid-level, and now you feel like, okay, you want to go into C++, and then you just add your module from a user interface perspective. Once you have done this for modules, you might want to add your processors, so same thing, right? You have your module, and then you add your own processor, and then you can start developing in a simple IDE maybe, and compile, and this also works during runtime, by the way. So we feel like this is useful, and luckily domain people also feel it's useful. Inviwo is used in several interdisciplinary environments. In Ulm we have the MOMAN Center for Translational Imaging. In Sweden it's ELITE and CERC. CERC is the Swedish eScience Research Center, where many domain scientists from very different fields collaborate. Then more on the medical side, there's CMIV in Linköping and Transnaf in Ulm. So there's many collaborators from diverse domains which actually use Inviwo. And this is not just on the research side, but also on the outreach side. So we have several installations in museums which run 24/7. And we also have commercial use of Inviwo. Here's an example from Context Vision. So all these concepts we developed for us to make us happy with the system, they apparently make other people happy too. Yeah? And we see this as a validation for the design decisions which need to be taken. So this brings me to my final lesson, and this is probably the first thing you should deal with. You should establish a foundation for everything like this. Yeah? Developing software is not just about code. There's so many other things. And just to mention two, there's naming things. You need to decide this very early on, what should be the naming of your system. Inviwo, by the way, stands for Interactive Visualization Workshop, Inviwo. Yeah? And the name should be expressive, it should be unique, it should not be too cryptic. You should check the URL is available, GitHub is available, and things like this. For instance, inviwo.org in the beginning was not available. Luckily for us, the project which was hosted there was not current anymore, and the holder of the domain, she was very kind, and she transferred the domain to us. You're not always that lucky, but I feel these things are important, but of a rather minor importance. The major importance should be in the beginning on your licensing. In general, I can only recommend choose a very open license. We have simplified BSD. Apache is also fine. Something where everybody can do everything. Because if you want to scale up a project, then you want to have different sites contributing to this project. And if you have a too closed open source license even, yeah, then some of the sites might not be too happy with it. Yeah? So with our license, we could collaborate with museums, with companies, with universities, all over the place, and this was never a problem. Another very important aspect is that you connect with your legal office at your university and you find out what are the rules of the game. So we develop in Sweden and in Germany, so I know these situations quite well, and they are very different. Yeah? So if you do this in some other country, it might be different again. So different people who have different contracts of different institutions, they might have or might not have the rights to the code they write during the work time or even in their spare time. Yeah? So it's very important that you find this out and that you know what are the regulations, yeah, and that you are able to deal with it. How we dealt with it, and we felt this was a great thing to do, we transferred all rights to the so-called Inviwo Foundation. So the Inviwo Foundation is a foundation we have formed which is independent of the universities, and all rights are with the Inviwo Foundation, and the Inviwo Foundation takes care that this is, stays simplified BSD and so on. And of course it's important to sort these things out before something is at stake. You might be very surprised how many people come up with claims to the software as something gets successful. Yeah? So sort these things as early as possible, even when it's just a small nucleus of your software, but then you are sure this will pay off later on. And further on, you should connect with like-minded. Yeah? If you have a foundation, this is just for your software, but there's of course a bigger environment. And here, for instance, this is a connection with many people from the visualization community. This was a Shonan workshop in February 2020, which mainly Renata was organizing, and there were many visualization software developers. And this was a very insightful meeting. And we also came up with a paper based on our discussions. We have there a survey paper on the moving target of visualization software. So I recommend to have a look at this if you're interested into the topic, and also in general connect with people from the Viz community. There's a critical mass for software Viz. But then also outside of the Vis community, it's important to understand what other people think is important in software development. And this is a cross-university cooperation for people who do development of research software in Germany. And together we had a workshop, I believe it was in 2019, where we have identified certain challenges in this environment. And yeah, I just wanted to point out a few here, which I think really needs to be addressed by our community or by others. And most important, it's a lack of incentives and impact measures. So if you develop research software and you are focused on a career in research, then you have a conflict of interest, right? Because you spend a lot of time developing the software, but you will also have to invest a lot of time to write papers, and the time you invest in the software might not be incentivized or have certain impact measures attached to it. Citationware works great on this case, yeah. So software papers, if it's good used software, they are highly cited, by the way. Lack of awareness, lack of expertise and infrastructure are others, right? How do I set up a website? How do I set up a regression testing service and these things? Legal issues might be on the way. You have to figure out how this works in the country you're developing. And then there might be funding issues as well, right? So basic research gets a lot of funding. Writing grants for developing research software is a bit more difficult, but it's also improving now due to initiatives like the ones here on the slide. If you want to start in this, in general, research software, I would recommend those two websites, the Carpentries and the Code Refinery. They actually give tools for developers to improve their research software programming skills. So that brings me to the end. I would like to summarize that I've talked about 6 important lessons we have learned during the Inviwo development. There's probably many, many more we have learned, but I thought these ones might be good to communicate to others at this point. So always work as a team, make sure you have fun as a team too. Abstract, 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 but do not over-engineer. When you feel it would result in over-engineering, then you should eliminate alternatives consistently. So come up with a good argumentation for why you have chosen a certain alternative, and make sure this argumentation still holds when you have to sort out another alternative. And if this works a couple of times, then you can be pretty certain that you have identified the DNA of your software system and that you have good grounds for decisions. Evaluate this by using the software yourself. Make sure you make others happy, because then they will also use your software and they will give you insight, which not only will help to improve your software, but also to write application papers. And finally, establish a foundation to get all the basics sorted out. So if you are interested now in Inviwo and you would like to get started, I suggest go to the GitHub page. There you can start coding right away and contribute if you like. If you just want to try the binaries, go to the Inviwo website, inviwo.org. Or if you want to watch some tutorial videos, we have a YouTube Inviwo channel. And if you are interested in specific technical questions, go to our Inviwo Slack. All developers are active in the Slack, so all technical questions can be discussed there in great detail. I would like to point out that we are also proud of the fact that we actually have a good documentation of Inviwo. We take documentation very serious because we know it's key for others to get started with Inviwo. And finally, I would like to acknowledge first and foremost the entire Inviwo team, which has done a great job to bring out the software. The organizations behind this, it's Linköping University, University of Ulm, and KTH. We have several funding sources in Germany and Sweden. And if you like Inviwo and you want to use it, please cite our paper. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much, Timo, for this great and interesting talk. I see that already a number of questions have accumulated in the chat. although there are also already some answers, I will try to navigate this together with you. So I think something I would really pick up on and modify it a little bit. Michael Krone asked, so do you think developing Inviwo was well spent, or would you not start the project again if you were in the position again now? I mean, this was partially answered by your talk, I would say, but I would also kind of modify this with another sub-question. Is there something you would actually want to change in the design of Inviwo after nearly a decade of software life? Or did you already change that? Or did you already change something? And how expensive was that?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I mean, as you said, partially it was answered in my talk. I hope the answer was a clear yes. I hope you got it. I never said that at some point, but that's what the answer would be to this question, because we see a lot of benefits. And to your extension to this question with respect to what we would like to change, well, there's many things we could change and we discussed to change. Maybe one thing here particularly I would like to discuss about is what I've been discussing with Peter actually before this talk, and this is the whole dynamics of the network, right? So for us, at the moment, with this functional interpretation of our processors, we have a static data flow graph, right? So the idea is you generate this data flow graph at one point, and then data flows through it, and you generate some output images or data or whatever. But this is a static nature. So sometimes you would like to have things more dynamic, right? So you might want to change the topology of your data flow network based on your input, for instance. Or you might want to have property sets changed on your inputs. And these dynamics we have currently not realized in Inviwo. It's a huge re-engineering task there. And this is certainly something which would be helpful in several domains. We have property sets, so what you can do is you can save basically the state of a network independent of the topology, and then you have different states and you load them based on the data, but it's not really like, let's say, in the core under the hood in Inviwo, and we cannot at the moment really do dynamic processors. So if you, networks, if you really want to do this, then you would need to implement it on top of that, essentially on your own.
Okay, thank you. That's very interesting. Actually, I was already wondering myself now, going back to these properties, now that you talked about them, I was actually wondering along similar lines, can it happen that property changes cascade in a way that you either get feedbacks or, let's say, frame lags across property changes? So this part of the synchronization of your architecture was a little bit unclear to me at that point.
So it's designed in a way that it cannot happen because it's properly synchronized beforehand and then we process. So we have to, of course, make sure that this is without any latency and so on, so that this works fast. But then during processing, this is fixed. This is, of course, also a constraint at that point, right? At some point, you might want to change a property based on the data, and this is again related to the dynamics. Yeah, exactly. So yeah, it's along the same line where we are rather static with respect to the data flow.
Okay. Yeah, I have a question from Christina. This was partially answered, but I think it is interesting for a lot of people, so I will repeat it here. So how do you gather funding for the people that work on projects, especially if they work for a longer period of time than a PhD actually lasts, usually?
Yeah, that's actually very difficult, yeah. And that also depends on the university system. So I think the Swedish system has an advantage there. So Peter Stenetek, who's the de facto manager of the whole project, he has a permanent research engineer position in Engel group. And this is something which is in Sweden, I feel a bit easier to accomplish than it's in the German system. So in the German system, to get funding for such a long term is more difficult, and we get more funding on the research side of things. Yeah. So I think in general, you can differentiate between two types of funding sources here. One is more like for research software per se. Yeah, so I would say the CERC funding from which Peter is paid goes along this line. In Germany, the German Research Foundation also has this call. I know you're also involved in this, Guido. So luckily, people have realized that it's important to give funding towards these platforms. But compared to basic research, it's actually very little funding, and there's not so many opportunities there. The other side of things are more application-oriented things. So for instance, I was mentioning the TransNav project. This is an initiative which is about cardiovascular surgeries and planning of these. And there we use Inviwo as the main platform. And so we get funding to extend the Inviwo platform in order to serve these purposes. So I would say these are the two main funding sources we have: more platform-driven, very rare, very hard to get, especially long-term; more application-driven, which is actually much easier to get.
Now, of course, depending on the project, you always have to explore your own avenues. I mean, that's the main problem currently, that there are no fixed answers which are fit for everyone. But yeah, looking at the time, I think we should take the rest of the questions offline. I mean, there are still in the Discord chat, so please use the Discord chat over the rest of the conference. We can still talk about the issues that were raised here afterwards, because otherwise we will break our schedule. That said, thank you again, Timo, for your great keynote. And
yeah,
now,
thank you very much for giving me the opportunity.
And now I will get to the next program point, which means 2 regular talks for the rest of the session. And welcome back. So the first regular paper talk is Isha Sharma, and she will tell us about OSPRay Studio, enabling multi-workflow visualizations with OSPRay. Isha, the stage is yours.
Visualization is a diversified field. We have architecture, product, medical, and scientific visualization, to name a few categories. Hence, there are many special purpose applications for supporting these visualizations. To bridge the gap between multiple applications, we like to present the case study of a minimal application with lightweight core architecture that is both extensible and scalable. It's called OSPRay Studio. You can check our presentation on this topic at 3 p.m. on June 14th.
Hi and welcome everyone to my paper presentation titled OSPRay Studio, enabling multi-workflow visualizations with OSPRay. The quick agenda for the following presentation would be going through the motivation, features, and design for this application, followed by targeted use cases and some real-world applications, and finally discussing some future opportunities. First, briefly describing what we mean by multi-workflow visualizations. So visualizations that need a separate workflow each. For example, more physically based rendering requirement for product and architectural visualization datasets, and volumetric rendering for medical visualization, and correct simulation property renderings for large scientific visualization datasets. And hence, we coined the term multi-workflow visualizations as a visualization metaphor for describing the visual complexity of the different kinds of data sets involved. Now, there are different visualization and rendering applications currently available. And the different classes of rendering applications and visualization applications differ mostly because of their domain applications. For example, ParaView, Insight, and Visit are most well known for scientific visualization, and while Blender and Maya for 3D content creation, and there are other applications for rendering. So basically, due to their domain-specific applications, they become very non-agile and the feature development is mostly pertaining to the very specific domain that they cater to, and hence become monolithic in nature. So to solve this problem, we developed the idea of OSPRay Studio as a simple to use and lightweight application, which is scene graph based for interactive visualizations. And this is a stack overview of how Intel OSPRay Studio depends on other libraries. It depends on Intel OSPRay as its core rendering engine, and depends on the rendering algorithms that Intel OSPRay provides. For example, the path tracer for physically based rendering, and the SciVis renderer for raycast renderings for large scientific visualization data sets, and also ambient occlusion renderings, which in turn depends on ray acceleration data structures and algorithms of Intel Embry, volumetric rendering from OpenVKL, and denoising capabilities of Intel OpenImage denoise. Intel OSPRay also has thread level and SIMD level parallelism for providing interactive frame rates for large scientific visualization data sets, which Intel OSPRay Studio ultimately leverages. Then also for MPI offload and MPI distributed capabilities, we depend on Intel OSPRay for rendering. Now, the design goals for developing Intel OSPRay Studio are mostly listed here. So these were the 4 main design goals. The main core application should be lightweight, and the second design goal mostly is in conjunction with the first design goal. So the functionality should be abstract from the core architecture, and the design should be extensible so that it can incorporate different workflows needed to support different kinds of visualization. And finally, scale and scalability is the core to visualization, for which we depend on OSPRay's MPI distributed capabilities. These are quick feature highlights of OSPRay Studio. It provides file importers for both surface-based visualization and volume-based visualization in OBJ, GLTF, VDB, structured and unstructured volume formats. Then there is also possibility to export the rendered frames as images and scenes. Then the most important part of OSPRay Studio is the scene graph library, which is a library of node classes and visitor classes to create the scene graph. And this also includes animation and skinning. Then finally, the extensibility part of the software, it comes from the plugins, which are runtime loadable shared object libraries that can extend the features of the scene graph or even the OSPRay Studio UI. Then finally, we have modes. These are basically different ways of interacting with the application. This can be either a GUI mode or a batch mode, and even a time series mode. So GUI mode is mostly supported by the last feature, which is the GUI and the widgets. The GUI is the main part of the main window application, which provides access to various editors for scene objects to the OSPRay Studio users, and widgets mostly extend the standard custom GUI. Now we will quickly discuss the OSPRay Studio design in an overview. So there are 2 main components to OSPRay Studio. One is the application component and one is the scene graph library. The application component mostly defines the user interaction with OSPRay Studio. For example, the GUI application component would provide editors and builders for different scene objects on top of a GLFW window. And a scene graph library is a library that implements most of the internal scene representation for OSPRay Studio. We will briefly discuss what is the scene graph library. So the scene graph library implements the internal scene state of OSPRay Studio at any given point in time. It's an abstract scene graph for the scene state, and it contains 2 kinds of classes, the nodes classes and the visitors classes. The nodes classes are responsible for creating the scene graph, and the visitors classes are responsible for performing node-specific tasks on the scene graph once it is created. A quick detour as to what an abstract scene graph is. An abstract scene graph is a design concept, and it represents the internal scene structure of OSPRay Studio at any given point in time. It is a directed acyclical graph of scene objects, and such that every scene object can be represented as a node and has at least one parent, and every node can have multiple child, and it's a top to bottom parent-child relationship. And what it means for OSPRay Studio is that different scene objects can be represented as scene nodes. For example, a light object can be represented as a light node in the scene graph, having a transform node as a parent to define its position. So the purpose of the scene graph was basically to keep the scene structure kind of separate from the renderer scene hierarchy. And as you can see, like this is on the left-hand side, we have the scene structure from OSPRay Studio, which is much more coarse than the scene structure from OSPRay, which is more dense and has more objects. So the scene graph can be rendered using a particular rendering implementation. For example, a visitor will implement this. Currently, we have one visitor for implementing the OSPRay rendering implementation, and it allows for loose coupling between the two scene representations. And this also allows for implementing features like animations, which change the transform that are applied on the geometry. So even introduction of new objects in the scene during render time can be facilitated with such an abstract scene hierarchy. And ultimately, the backend scene hierarchy is updated simultaneously, and new frames are received from OSPRay. Coming back to the scene graph library, there are three types of basic node classes. The generic node class is the base node class that implements functions like creating a child and adding a node, which are responsible for creating the abstract scene graph. Then we have the strongly typed classes, which implement specific data types like strings or integers as nodes. These can later be used as properties of different scene nodes. And finally, we have the OSPRay typed node classes, which create OSPRay objects internally and store a handle to them. Now, all the nodes are connected in a parent-child graph structure, as shown before. And the root node of the OSPRay Studio scene graph is the frame node, and it contains the frame buffer, camera, renderer, and world children. Now, these four objects are the main objects of the OSPRay OSP render frame API. And more documentation on this can be found at this link. Finally, since the scene graph represents the scene configuration, it can be exported as a portable visualization state that would contain all of the scene objects like lights, cameras, materials. And in OSPRay Studio, we can do that in a JSON format file. These are called the .sg files, and the .sg files are editable. That is, you can modify them offline and load them in separate instances of OSPRay Studio. Now here on the right-hand side, we have an example from a saved .sg file showing one of the nodes, like the importer node, which is defined by the subtype. It's an obj importer, and the name property and the file name properties are listed, followed by the children's property, which has a node of type transform, and to which the rest of the imported scene gets attached. Now, that was about nodes classes. Finally, about the visitors classes. The visitors are design patterns that implement different operations on different elements. And in OSPRay Studio, this means different operations on different nodes of the scene graph. These are the classes that implement different rendering backends, and currently only OSPRay rendering backend is implemented. These classes are also responsible for converting the scene graph to a representation that would be understood by the backend, and also responsible for committing the scene graph to a format that the OSPRay API would be expecting. Apart from creating the render graph or the scene representation that the backend would expect, they can also perform other node-specific tasks like generating widgets for an expandable GUI editor for the scene graph or other tasks. Here is a hypothetical example of an abstract scene graph and how the render scene visitor would perform different functions on different nodes of the scene graph. So traversing it top to bottom, the render scene would perform different functions, like on the transform node, it will create an instance. On a material node, apply materials, and on the geometry node, create geometry. The final part is the GUI and the widgets, which for visualization, a faster GUI to modify scene properties is very essential. And for that purpose, OSPRay Studio uses DRM GUI for the GUI and menus on top of a GLFW window. And DRM GUI is used for both the main menu and the widgets, and it's easy to minimize and avoids cluttering. Now, widgets also provide custom GUI controls, like for example, in this image on the right, it provides animation controls, such as the play button and other animation controls for an animated scene. In OSPRay Studio, animations are both articulated and skinned. And by progressing this time bar on the animation controls channel, it would update the transform of the animated object. Then for the extensibility part of the design, plugins are the main features, and these are shared object libraries that are loaded at runtime, and they can be used for implementing new features like implementing a new file importer for a custom data format or UI menus, and also extend the scene graph library with new scene graph nodes, like new geometry, volumes, or materials. They inherit from the plugin class and implement the main method init plugin name. The derived plugin classes, they can either have a UI panel that allows the plugin to interact with the user design of the scene graph, or it can just implement a main method. And the plugins can also register new scene graph nodes to create a new scene graph. Now, finally, one of the use cases of the plugins was to implement a custom importer for the NASA Fund 3D data. This was used to create a custom importer for the Fund 3D data type. And what this means for OSPRay Studio was large fluid simulation volumes could be imported into OSPRay Studio without altering, and could be represented as a time series of data. As you can see, with the same animations control for time series data. Now, since these are volumes, these were loaded with transfer function editor, which could modify the property of the volumes directly. And then apart from the widgets that are loaded specifically for this data set, the original menu with the lights editor and the camera snapshots are still available. This is the second example of where plugins were used to implement a custom car configurator for Bentley Motors collaboration. Now, these car models from Bentley are very elaborate models with 25 million triangles each. And with the car configurator, we could easily change the properties of these objects, like materials or paint of the material. And this was implemented as a plugin as well. Finally, the future directions of this application include data analysis rather than just data presentation, a web visualization system around around the headless batch mode, and support for more data formats, support for Python in terms of Python binding, and support for the Anari backend for other rendering implementations. Thanks.
Thank you, Isha, for this overview of our OSPRay Studio. Let's have a look for questions. There are none in the chat yet. However, I have a couple of questions of my own. I was actually wondering, so this design behind OSPRay Studio with this added level of abstraction, how relevant and important is this for other people trying to integrate OSPRay into their rendering or visualization solution? So should this be a future go-to solution instead of implementing OSPRay directly, adding this additional layer of abstraction, or is it just for use inside OSPRay Studio only?
I mean, OSPRay is a library and it does not come with an application front end. So if you want to load an asset into OSPRay, you might have to write a quick application for doing so. But OSPRay Studio, it already comes with the file loaders and the OSPRay backend, and the whole purpose is to present the OSPRay rendering engine to users for quickly loading assets other than just what the OSPRay provides, like the sample tutorials in the example app.
This is just a rapid prototyping solution, so to say.
Yes, we can say that it can be used as a rapid prototyping solution as well, because it's extensible and it comes with some example plugins that can show how to implement a specific workflow for visualization.
Okay, then it also stands to reason to have a Python interface for even more accessibility and wider audience, right?
Yes, and it is already already has a preliminary Python binding solution, which is available on the current release. It's on GitHub, and it's actually Python bindings for the scene graph nodes, and it already comes with 2 sample Python scripts to show how we can use the same API that exists in the scene graph library nodes class to quickly generate Python script for Python users.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, looking at the time, I think we should quickly move on to the next presentation because we're already a little bit behind.
Yes.
So thank you again for your presentation. Okay, now we'll come to the last talk of this session. It will be Dominik Engel presenting property-based testing for visualization development. Dominik, the stage is yours.
Hi, this is Dominik Engel from Krone University. Today I present, together with Stegmaier, our recent work on property-based testing for visualization development. So throughout this talk, we will first have a look at common testing methodologies that we see in today's visualization frameworks, and we will look at some of their issues, specifically their poor parameter coverage. We will then discuss how property-based testing can help to reduce this problem. To this extent, we discuss how property-based testing works and how it can be adapted to be used in visualization development. Lastly, we will show an exemplary implementation based on Inviwo and some use cases to show the applicability of property-based testing in visualization development. So to start, let's have a look at current visualization frameworks. The current state of testing there is that there are 2 major types of tests. The first is unit tests, which we are probably all familiar with, where we test singular units, usually programmatically. The second is regression tests. And the goal here is to find errors in interactions of different parts of the software. It's a feature interaction test. And for visualization purposes, those regression tests are usually based on image comparisons. That means the authors of the test produce a rendering which they find correct, and then they save it. And when they make changes to the code, they will later on load this image, try to reproduce it exactly, and if they fail to do so, they will say that they have found an error. Now, we found this methodology to have 2 major problems. coming from the fact that visualization and rendering algorithms usually have many parameters. Creating a regression test with the aforementioned strategy will fail to find errors that only occur with different parameters from the ones that you used when creating this image, right? Furthermore, there might also be errors that you only really see when you're changing a parameter. To this end, we propose to use the concept of property-based testing in visualizations. This concept allows us to create tests declaratively by defining the expected effect that we would want to see on the resulting image caused by changing a certain parameter. From this, we would then generate tests automatically to cover this large parameter space. I will now give the word to Michael Stegmaier, who explains this process in detail.
In contrast to regular imperative testing, property-based testing is a declarative approach. The idea behind property-based testing is that the developer of tests specifies how to generate random inputs and specifies what properties are to be expected. A tool or library then generates inputs using the provided input generators and uses them to generate test cases that it tests the expected effects against. To avoid confusion with terms, we will use the term effects instead of properties on the following slides. But let me explain property-based testing by an example. Imagine a sorting algorithm for lists. One obvious effect we would expect from our sorting algorithm is that its output should be a sorted list. Another effect we would expect is that the sorted list should contain the same elements as the original list. So now that you learned about property-based testing, I'm going to explain how we adapted its concepts for visualization development. For this, we provide a tool that we call Property Analyzer. With the Property Analyzer, we provide default input generators for integers, floats, doubles, and ranges of these types. Now let's look into more detail on how we allow a visualization developer to specify expected effects. At first, we automatically gather all the parameters that are involved in the calculation of the visualization. For each of the gathered parameters, we let the developer specify what effect is to be expected when the value of the parameter is increased. For example, from an increase of the lower bound of a clipping plane, we expect a greater or equal amount of visible background pixels. In addition to the common comparison operators such as equals, not equals, less than, and so on, there also is not comparable. Not comparable is meant to be used for parameters that should be randomized, but result in uncomparable outputs. An example of such a not comparable parameter would be the angle of the camera. If the camera does not look at the object anymore, all other parameters cannot be compared anymore. But still we will want to test our parameters with different angles of the camera. So in this case we would use the not comparable. Okay, so instead of simply generating random values for all the parameters, we follow a systematic approach. A study on feature interaction testing has shown that testing the pairwise interaction of features already reveals most of the defects of a set of interacting features. So after generating random values for the properties, we want to have each pair of generated values covered by our test cases. For illustration purposes, imagine three features, A, B, and C, of which each can have two different values. Generating pairs out of these feature values results in this set of pairs. We get 12 pairs out of 3 features with 2 possible values each. Now it should be easy to imagine how this would lead to a combinatorial explosion when there are more features that can have more values. To solve this issue, there are algorithms to generate covering arrays that are as small as possible. A covering array algorithm generates assignments that all together cover all pairs. So let me illustrate how this works. At first, we could create an assignment that assigns the first value of each feature, so A1, B1, C1. This assignment covers the 3 pairs that I colored with blue. In the next step, we could assign the second value of each feature, so A2, B2, C2. This assignment covers the pairs that I colored in green. When we continue like that, we will cover more and more pairs, until we finally cover all pairs. In this case, we generated a covering array with these 6 assignments. So now, we have an algorithm to systematically generate test cases for us, right? Unfortunately, it's not that easy. Do you remember what I told you about not comparable? A property that is specified as not comparable makes 2 tests only comparable if that feature has the same value. So for example, if the camera has the same angle. If there are multiple parameters that are specified as not comparable, we could easily end with a covering array that is mostly unusable. So for our purposes, we cannot just generate a covering array that is as small as possible. We still want to have it as small as possible, but at the same time also have it contain as many comparable tests as possible. To achieve this, we adapted the discrete SLJ strategy proposed by Sarkar et al. To take the number of comparable tests into account as well. Okay, so now that we can generate test cases, we can finally find errors in our visualization, can we? Well, imagine the property analyzer reports an error. That means at least one of the expected effects is violated. In this error that you can see here, it reports which values it used for which property and shows the resulting image. In my example, we have randomized as many properties as there are letters in our alphabet. But what's wrong now? Where is the error? Which parameter is causing the error? We could now reproduce this configuration and try to understand what goes wrong. Or we could, for example, try changing some of the parameters and see how this takes effect. So this is where the concept of shrinking comes into play. After an error is detected, with shrinking, we would remove more and more of the randomized values and see if still an error occurs. So in our example, if we start by resetting Z to its original value and see that it still violates an expected effect, we would continue to reset more and more randomized parameters until as long as the expected effect is still violated. In the end, we will find a configuration where when we reset just one more parameter, no more expected effect will be violated. And this is when we found a minimal configuration that indicates an error. Please note that this minimal configuration could as well only contain a single parameter if one parameter itself is at fault already, or it could as well be empty, which is the case if the original configuration is at fault already. Okay, so now I give back the word to Dominik.
So this is the Inviwo framework. Similar to many other visualization frameworks, we can define a data flow network. The nodes of this graph we call processors, and they represent functional units like data loading, volume raycasting, displaying. And each of those processors furthermore exposes all of its underlying parameters using the properties you can see here on the right. This then includes things like a transfer function and lighting parameters, depending on the processor. So this network that we can see here implements volume raycasting with the result seen here on the left. And we furthermore added the option for clipping. So we have a lower and a upper bound for the clipping along the x-axis. And now we would like to test this using our property-based testing implementation. So what we do is we use the property analyzer and we get the resulting rendering of the raycaster as an input. And in its properties, we can then make settings to define our test. So first of all, as an image metric, what we're going to use is the number of background pixels. And then what we're going to set is for all the properties from the network above that are grabbed here, we will take the clipping slices here and we will set it so that when we increase the lower bound of the clipping, so this part, then we will also increase the number of background pixels we see. And similarly, if we increase the upper bound, then it will decrease. Right? So we set the greater equal and less equal operators here. For the Y and C slices, we actually set a not comparable operator to just generate different settings without comparing them directly with the X results. So let's look at a few different test cases that our algorithm generates. As you can see, we go through a bunch of different settings here, and this is exactly what we want to see. So let's look at a few more use cases, how we could apply property-based testing in visualization. One example is, of course, lighting. In our clipping example, we've looked at the number of background pixels as an aggregated image metric. We could also think of things like just the average brightness or pixel-wise brightness of an image. And in our example here, we can, for example, see that when we increase the diffuse light intensity from the left to the right, then we also see a monotonic increase in brightness in the resulting rendering, or individual pixel for that matter. And you can do similar tests for ambient and specular lighting as well. However, note that you must test for those independently, because in this case, different settings for the other lighting components may make the tests uncomparable. Another idea is you could test your compositing algorithms using property-based testing. Here what we can see is a rendering with the transfer function right next to it. And the idea would be we could just modify some of those control points in the transfer function. For example, we could increase this red one here. And then what we would expect to see in our resulting image is, of course, that each pixel should increase or stay the same in alpha. Yeah, and with those concepts, we can cover a large part of the parameters that we miss otherwise. So just to summarize, we propose to use property-based testing for visualization development. With those property-based tests, we can test for interactions in our visualization. We can define the tests declaratively without the need to code, just from within the GUI. And we can directly define the expectations that we have on a result rendering, which is a very natural thing to do in visualization. However, note we still recommend to use this in addition to existing unit and regression tests, not as a replacement. Lastly, I'd like to thank you for attending the talk, and I'm happy to take your questions.
Thank you for this great talk. I have a couple of questions for you. Namely, I was wondering, you were talking about randomizing parameter values, right?
Yep.
For different tests. So is there a way of doing regression testing based on the same data? So do you somehow serialize the randomness that comes out, or is this just basically for single fire use test cases?
Well, first of all, thanks for the introduction. To answer your question, so when we're testing, or sorry, can you repeat the question again? I'm very sorry.
No problem. I was wondering whether there is some kind of connection between the randomized parameter values you can put inside a test and regression testing, so whether you can combine both.
Yeah, right. So the regression testing is, we usually just set up like a workspace with all the parameters, right? And we create an image. And we usually use this, or those regression tests we have, as a base to then extend and add those property-based tests in order to check more parameters. So, but when we actually want to run them later on, what we usually have is, for the input generators, there are a bunch of extreme values that we always use. For example, for floats that might be like the minimum float, the maximum float, things like 0 and 1, and then we can draw random values uniformly in between. And usually we would just redraw them every time we run the test. So we would have different values in different runs of the test for some of those cases. But of course, we could as well just save a seed or anything and reproduce the very same values again. But then again, we are kind of stuck with having a fixed set of parameters that we're testing against a fixed set of outcomes, right?
Yeah. Okay, thanks. Christina is asking, did you test the concept on other libraries or frameworks? And if yes,
No,
which one?
we have just implemented this in Inviwo so far, but what we have at least looked on is that this whole algorithm with the covering arrays, like generating the test cases and how you would optimize for that, is kind of very separate from Inviwo. So that's like easy to adopt, but of course, getting the input generator, so tying it directly to, in Inviwo's case, the properties where you make the settings, and also comparing with the images in the end would have to be adapted in other frameworks.
Thank you. Yeah, since we are quite a bit over time, to have a little bit of break left, I would thank all the speakers again. Thank you for presenting. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next session in about a quarter of an hour. Thanks again. Bye.
Thanks.